Hey everyone, welcome back. So in this video I just wanted to start by recapping where we're up to so far in the class before we get on with the content side for this week. So far we've managed to low poly and unwrap our beetle here for our final mesh. You can see the mesh here inside of Substance Painter. In the classes we went through mostly the leg, but here I have the finished beetle with the head and the body as well. So we've actually baked all of those textures inside of Marmoset here and then transferred those over into inside of Painter here. So here you can see the ID map. With the ID map as well, I'm trying to match the material colors. So you can see here red is where we have one material, blue is another, green and yellow and so on. So we want to try and keep that consistent across the different texture sets so we can apply the same materials. And then we've got our ambient occlusion, our curvature, positional data, thickness. So that should be the majority of the textures that we need. I'm not going to be using a normal map, and I won't be using height, bent normals, or opacity for this. So yeah, so that's the setup, and that's where we should be so far as the Substance Painter scene is concerned. Hey everyone, so in this video I just wanted to start by going over our reference gathering. So usually when I'm approaching texturing I will build out a new reference board. The reference board I showed in the first few weeks was definitely more about the modeling and how to actually design our shapes and figure out the overall design of our beetle together. So when I get to texturing, usually what I'll do is try to break out the texturing into a separate board because there's certain details I know I want to capture in reference that I'm not going to necessarily capture with my other reference board. So this is a new one that I created. And so the first step here is just to think about how we're going to texture it. So I have my overall beetle reference here and the colors and some of the ideas. I know I wanted to go for this sort of black and yellow color scheme, not entirely yellow, because you can see in some cases we get other tones like oranges and things mixing in there as well, which I think is a really nice sort of aesthetic where it doesn't always feel like it's the same color yellow. It often is mixing in with different tones and things. I just love the contrast of that as well. You can see here on I think this is a scarab. You can see the sort of contrast, and the other thing as well is that it has these really nice designs on the back. So the pattern on the shell itself, that's something I also wanted to capture from the actual real world reference, because I'm working out how I'm going to apply that as far as the design for the final beetle. Cool, so that's that. We have some 3D reference. This is mostly from assets that I collected that had pretty good texturing that I wanted to try to get something along the same kind of lines as that. So just as a guide and some inspiration for texturing, I've got a couple of 3D references there. Some movie stuff. This is from Star Wars, so we can see we've got the KX droid and some nice shots of those. We'll get into that in a second. And then this is the most important part of what I'm tending to do this week, which is to break down the individual materials. So we have this beetle. If we pull this over here, you'll see this is our main source. So we've got different colors. We've got the darker kind of material. We've got the yellow. I know as well from when I blocked out the materials, I also wanted some other smaller details such as metal and other parts. So like maybe a steel type metal, maybe a bronze or a brass or something like that. So those were my materials I wanted to go for. So then I start to break those out into different materials, and I try to find some key reference for those, what I'm aiming for as far as the material is concerned, and then reference that can help me. So here we can see, if we take a look at these individually, I'll sort of show the process there. So usually it's about grabbing reference. So here, this is for the darker material. I thought this is most likely to be a painted metal with some metal edgeware and chips. So here is, usually I'll try to get some key reference for the type of texture I'm trying to aim for, so I can get an idea of overall this is the look I'm trying to go for. Then I'll get supporting reference images, 3D materials if I can find them, and that type of thing. And then I'll also get real world objects, because if you've got objects, that can really help to understand what the edgeware is looking like and things like that. So in the case of the dark metal, you can see here, this is the sort of dark metal look with the edgeware. We've obviously got our supporting reference, and then these are some objects. So we've got doors, vents, and different objects here, and you can see the sort of overall look of what I was going for. So that approach is then what I will follow for everything else here as well. So here we have a yellow painted. I knew that I wanted yellow, obviously, from the key reference. So I figured turning that into a material that would make sense for hard surface, it would probably be painted metal again. So yeah, I'm trying to translate the real world into hard surface materials that I can apply to my robot. So in this case, we have the yellow painted. I was thinking maybe this could have some edge wear and maybe some rust and some breakup and things like that. And then here's some supporting reference for the type of thing. You can see that often it's pretty grimy. I like that we have these different colors going on. Sometimes we'll see the more orange look that comes from the rust as well in these cases, which I think is cool. Some examples of some rust. And then we also have the same kind of look, but just different colors. So that sometimes can be helpful just because you get slightly different things going on there. And then again, this is all object-based stuff. So you can see here that we have that yellow paint on actual objects and how that looks on real world examples. I think that's always good. If you can find your own reference in the real world for this as well, that can also be super helpful. And then here we have this idea of more of a tarnished kind of steel look or metal look. I wanted it to feel grimy and dirty. And I wasn't super bothered about rust. I wanted to keep this like pretty clean, but I definitely wanted to have more of this kind of nice detail, maybe scratches and that type of stuff. That was the look I was going for. I really like this kind of, you know, how this feels like with the sort of dirt build up and then maybe some of the smaller details like the scratches and damages on the object as well. And then I was thinking maybe a brass or bronze. I wasn't too fussed about which one, just something that could give me that kind of gold or colored metal look. That was sort of the vibe I was going for there. Here's some examples of some real world reference, key reference, and then a bunch of objects with this applied on it, and then some textures and reference and things here. So that was the texturing board, and then I just used that when I start to work into my materials. This is what I'm looking at as my key reference images there. So now we'll jump over into Substance to start our texturing process. Okay, so I just want to start the texturing process by detailing out how I usually set up my layers and working with the setup here in terms of Substance Painter. So the first thing that I'll always make sure I do is add a empty layer. So I'll just add this fill layer here. I usually rename that to base, and this will just be a bunch of base values. And so the benefit of doing this, I'll just sort of showcase here, is once we start to get into adding in smart materials as an example here, you can see when we go and cycle through our channels by hitting C on the keyboard here, that some of the channels have this transparency issue. So if we just add in our base layer, you'll see there's no visual change to the way things are looking. But as soon as we go through our individual channels, you'll see they're all filled out with some value. So I like to do that to avoid having any issues with transparency. It means I can read my debug views a lot clearer. And it's just a good practice to get into, is just putting an empty layer at the bottom of the stack there. And then the other thing I'll also do is add in a PBR validate node. So this is a node that comes with the shelf. Just come to the starter assets and just search for validate here. You'll see we have this PBR validate. So you just drag and drop that into the layer stack here. And then it will add that in on top of the substance layer. So you can see that there. This you would want to set up so you set it to 50 RGB and 70 to 100% reflectance there for checking our PBR values. And it should be green on the model. So you can see here that this is green at the moment. That means that everything is within value range. And so that's what we're looking for there as we're working through our values. And you can see a couple of areas where it's starting to go red, which means that it's a little bit too dark. In those cases, you just want to make sure that the majority of your object is going to be green. So if you're going below 50 RGB for a non-metal, that's usually going to be too dark. And then if you're for metallics, you want to stick within that 70% range. So if you're making a pure metal, that's where you want to aim for in terms of value there. So that's what we're looking at in terms of PBR values. As far as this, I'm going to go through creating these smart materials from scratch, but this is roughly how I would start out my materials. So you can see here a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be aiming towards. So we've got our materials sort of set out there. Those are going to be our smart materials. And then we're going to basically mask these using the color ID selections that we created earlier. So you can see here that we can mask out the different areas. I also sometimes will add in paint if I wanted to manually kind of add that material in somewhere, or using geometry selection and everything, I can assign that material to different areas depending on what I want to do. So yeah, so now we're going to work into creating our first smart material. So I wanted to start by just talking briefly about anchor points. So if you haven't used them before, they're basically a reference to a layer or to a particular type of effect. So you can create anchor points really easily by just right clicking and adding an anchor point. So here we can do that on the layer, or we can also do that on the mask as well. So we get different types of anchor points depending on what we were doing. So just as a really basic example of how anchor points can be useful, if we paint in an example of material here, so we have our red mask, and we'll paint this in as well. Let me just come in here, and I'll do that with a little bit more of a harder brush. So we have our shape. So this is going to be our example. So we'll just create an example there, and then I'm going to add an anchor point to this. So this is now a reference, and I can reference that anywhere else in terms of the layers. So as an example here, we'll create another material. We'll create blue, and we'll add a black mask to this, and then we're going to add a fill layer. And then from here, we'll add that anchor point that we just created, which was the example mask. So you can see that we have now a copy of what we had here. But what's really great about this is we can then add effects to this. So we could blur this mask, for example, now. And you can see that we can create this effect here. And then we can take the anchor point again. So we'll add a fill again. And then we'll add that anchor point in with the example mask. And this time, instead of it being a normal blend, we'll do a subtract blend. And you can see that now we can create this nice halo type effect. So when we paint in this original mask, this is going to create that effect basically, which is a really nice example. So that's a super basic example. One of the things I like to do in my projects is if I'm going to be using a bunch of materials over and over again, so dirt is a good example, or maybe metal is a good example, I like to create a folder with base materials in there. And then here is a great example of this with the dirt, is I created an anchor point for the dirt here. So you can see that that's just a dirt material. I've put some textures in there for dirt, and I've created an anchor point. So then later on, I can turn this on. If I had a material, let's say we have something like this, we can turn off, say, some of the effects and some of the dirt and everything here. Let's just remove these. And let's say I wanted to do a dirt effect. I could add a fill layer in, and then under the actual channels, I can come in and select my channels here. So I can select my dirt. I could do the same for the roughness. So it's going to have the right roughness and everything. And then I can add a mask here, and we could do, say, a generator or something. So what's good about this is it's basically referencing that material from below. So it's nice and cheap in terms of the layer effect. It means that it's not having to calculate effects and things there multiple times. We're not having to have loads of folders where we duplicate the dirt a bunch of times. We're just going to reference that dirt. So that's really handy when you're building your materials. It means you can pull from your base materials below. So again, same kind of thing with the if we were doing, let's go through and do the metal edgeware one as well. I've got a base metal, so I'll come in with the base metal. For this one, we'd want it to be metallic, so we can pull that base metal that we have in our base material there, and then add in, say, an edgeware, again, like an effect, like a generator or something, and we'll do a metal edgeware, and that's going to now use that metallic from below. So you can see here that we have our metal edgeware, but it's using the metal from that base material. So we've got our values all set up correct and everything. And then if we make any changes or tweaks to this base metal, then it's going to propagate through in terms of our anchor point. So it's an instance of that layer, right? So I just wanted to show that workflow. One of the downsides to this particular way of working is if you have these base materials in a folder outside of your smart material, and then you try to do an instantiate, which basically means we can create this material effect on other texture sets. So just show that here. We'll create it now on the leg. You're going to see that what happens is a bunch of the details of this guy are not going to work. So things like the metal edge wear effects and everything, they're like when they're instantiated, you can see that they basically are just going to stop working, right? So that's something that you just have to keep in mind if you are going to work in this way, that you can't use instantiation across the texture sets with those types of effects, right? So you can do it, but you have to move these guys within to the folder here. So if we then move this as part of the same folder and then were to instantiate, this would definitely work then. So let's try and just show that process. You can see now we have the dirt and we have the edge wear and everything, and it's looking good. But then that kind of defeats the purpose of having the instantiation to begin with, to having the anchor point system to begin with, because we're trying to reference that in multiple groups and layers higher up. So the only way to really do that is then to have everything in one big folder that you instantiate. So as we build out all of our smart materials, we could create one big folder that we instantiate and everything will come across. So that's one way to do it as well. So just wanted to talk about those workflows because some of this stuff isn't super clear. It can be a bit confusing when it comes to how you actually have things set up. So I like to do this to save myself time. So I'll build out things like the dirt layers and everything there, and then build up our smart materials over time. So just wanted to sort of show that before we begin making our smart material. Okay, so now we're going to start building out our first smart materials and trying to work on our texturing here. So when I say smart materials, I'm basically just referring to a material contained within a folder. And so the first ones I want to start building out, which are going to make up the majority of our object here, is the dark plastic. And as I mentioned when I looked at the reference, I wanted this to be like a chipped kind of dark paint. This is my general reference for that. So you can see that we have some really nice stuff going on in these references. So a couple of things I wanted to point out here is the edge where you can see we've got sort of lots of nice light scratches on the paintwork. We've got kind of chips. We have these kind of stains as well to the material and a lot of color discoloration. You can see some darkness here in these areas, and then it's lighter here, some sort of dirt type stains, lots of nice details, sort of drips and that kind of stuff. And then same kind of thing here. You can see similar sort of stuff, dirt kind of build up, lighter stains, darker stains, all that kind of interesting stuff going on. And then I've got this really nice example from the KX Droid as well, where we have the, again, same kind of feel. We have the chips, we have some staining. And what I really liked about the dirt staining on this is that you can see it kind of feels like it accumulating as it dries. You can almost see that it's like dark around the edges and things like that. So you notice this if you have, say, like a tea stain or something. If you put a tea bag onto a plate and left it, it would create a stain very much like that, where it starts to sort of dry more towards the edges or darker towards the edges. And I just really like that aesthetic. I thought that was really cool. So yeah, and then lots of really great example references here as well, similar kind of ideas and scratches and things like that. So that's the kind of basis of what I'm going for. And so yeah, so first off, we want to start by just creating a couple of examples. In my reference, you can see that I had, say, the dirt and everything here. So to create that kind of base dirt material, all I did was basically create a fill layer, and then I put some textures into that fill layer. So you can see that there, right? So we can duplicate this as an example. Painter doesn't really come with many good dirt materials. So if you try to do a search just in the starter assets for dirt, you're not really going to get much coming up for dirt. You get some examples here. So if you want to build a base dirt, you can do that just by bringing in textures as I did there. The other alternative is that you just build it from grunges. So you can come in, say, with a grunge, like search for dirt or something like that, and then bring these kind of information into the base material, and then you can start to add filters to that. So we could come in with maybe, say, something like a gradient, and use the gradient to basically get our textures. So there's a couple of different ways to sort of build these kind of things up. But I would say, to be honest, like the most reliable result you're probably going to get is just by bringing in a texture. So we'll just use this as an example. We can build this in. So I'm going to just keep that how it is. And we've got our dirt. I made some adjustments to it. So this is just the base textures that I had. So we've got a base color, roughness, and a height. I'm not using metal and normal, so we can actually just remove those. And then I just fill some extra spot detail in there. So some BM spots on top. And if you double click these, you can rename them as well to keep yourself organized. So we have our BM spots there. And then I did a levels to basically reduce the height map information because I was finding that was just a little bit noisy and I want my dirt to generally be pretty basic there. And then if we want to make any further adjustments, so we could do, say, a filter here. And I often will use the hue saturation as a filter. So in this case, I might want to make the roughness maybe a bit rougher. I can just increase the lightness there. And if you alt click a channel, that's going to isolate it. So you can just easily create your dirt. So that's our dirt as our base. That's something that we wanted to create. We can create our metal edgeware for chips and things later, but we'll just put this into a folder and we'll just call this base materials. And then I'm going to start with my painted dark metal. So we'll just call this painted dark metal, metal dark. And then the first thing we're going to want to do is just add a fill layer and try and determine the value of our metal. And there's a couple of ways to do that, or our paint, I should say. The first way would be just to color pick from the reference, and that's going to give you a value. Sometimes you'll see that these get pretty dark. So I'm just color picking randomly from some of our key reference here. We could go even darker, but then this isn't really going to be great when we start looking at our PBR validate, right? So if we come over into here and pull this guy on top, we're going to struggle with some of these values depending on how dark they are. They could potentially get a little bit too dark. So you can see this one, for example, is too dark. So how do we actually determine that? One of the ways that I like to determine that is with charts. So if I come over into my PBR swatches, so this is taken from our PBR charts. I usually will just use those as a guide. So the darkest value for 50 is coal, so we could pick that. That's kind of as dark as we could go. And then we can also see we've got, say, a paint black material. So I would pick maybe paint black for this particular example, and then I can go a bit brighter if I wanted to. But this is probably a pretty good baseline, and we can just use our PBR charts for that particular detail, right? So that's something that can be pretty nice when it comes to just working into our materials and trying to figure out like what our baseline value is. So we'll just rename this base paint. Okay, so that's a good starting point. Now we can start to work a little bit more into our materials. So the first thing I'm going to want to do here is just try and get some response and plastic feel to this. And you can search in the library for materials and kind of then work backwards from these. So if you have smart materials already in the library, you can come in and pull these in and then take different parts from them. So a good way to kind of work is pull in, say, the plastic armor. So yeah, so that's how this one is looking, the plastic armor. So as you pull different ones in, different materials, we could also pull in our rubber as an example here. And then we can just sort of visualize like what type of detail is this giving us? Is this stuff that we want to take over into our own material, basically? So sometimes that can be handy. You can look at the actual materials as well. So we can come in with the basic plastic and then just pull that in as well and see, is that detail that we want to pull forward, right? So I also have in my own shelf as well, I have a series of different materials, like ones from textures.com, for example, like plastics and things. So that's another good way to do it. I can actually just pull in a plastic material and you can see this has some nice detail like roughness and things like that. And then I could potentially use that in my material. So I might want certain elements of that. So as an example, I don't want it to be, say, as dark as that material that we can see there. So I might just pull this in and then just use, say, the roughness only. And then for here, we can just have that as a color detail. So you can see already that gives us like some nice detail to our roughness and some variation that you can see from the material. And again, we can just do roughness. We could also do height information and other things as well. But that's how we can start to kind of build up just like a decent base there in terms of the material. If you don't have any like materials that you want to use, another way you can also start to do this is by grabbing roughness textures. So if we go to the start material here, come over into this section and start looking at our grunges, right? So we can start to build up detail in the roughness using the different grunge maps. And searching for, say, plastic, you might pull up some types of looks there, or you can just search for different grunges and see. So we can pick things that are going to look pretty nice. So generally, if you look at the ones that we have so far, if we go over to roughness and we look at this guy, you can see this is what we have in the roughness at the moment. So this has some sort of brighter values here and darker values. So we're looking for something maybe along those kind of lines if that's the type of look that we wanted to go for. So usually I'm just searching by eye for interesting grunges, maybe like the Grunge Leak Dirty could be a pretty good one to try out. So you just basically pull that into the roughness and then apply this, and you can sort of see that there. And then I'll usually set this to maybe triplanar projection, and we'll tile up the roughness there so you can start to see get some breakup. And that's what our roughness is starting to look like as we tweak these values. And then once this is set up nicely, then we can just pull in these other effects, like the other roughness effects, right? So we could swap this out, say for the Grunge Dirt Muddy, and then see how that looks. So we can easily just test how these types of results are working and what this is giving us from like a visual perspective, which can be pretty nice. So yeah, as we start to build these up, you can kind of see the result that we're getting there. So yeah, so that's given us a pretty good base to begin with. And then what I'll usually do, and we jump over into looking at our reference, you can see kind of how I structure the material here. So this is the sort of base material that we created. So we have our base. I add some effects and things on top, but this is the actual base here. So we'll just kind of go through that and I can show. So I have various different effects that we kind of start to build up. So this is just the base material, like the base plastic. And then as we start to add effects, you can see I've got some streaks, I've got some roughness variation, I've got some color variety. We do some edge wear, some lighter streaks, some surface detail. And then we start to just basically add an adjustment at the top. So that's kind of how we get to our base material here. So we'll go through just how to create this type of thing, and then as we can add the other effects on top of that. So, okay, so next up, what I wanted to cover is just how I would then start to take effects like this. So we have our roughness, and then pull this up. So these are our base values. This one is a base plastic, so we'll just put plastic shiny there. And then I want to start by adding a couple of different effects. So the first one is just roughness variation. So we're going to put roughness variation. And then I also want to make a folder for color variety as well. So for these guys, it's basically just by building up the effects that we have in the roughnesses, I'll change the blend modes as well. So we'll come over into the roughness channel, and then you can reduce the opacity to show those two combining together, those different roughnesses that we have. And then you can also play with things like overlay blend modes and see how that can actually impact the look as well. So depending on the blend mode that you select, you're going to get a different effect, and it's going to come together with these different roughnesses, right? So looking at the references as well, that's another thing you want to take a look at, so you can see different details building up, such as these kind of stains. So that's the type of stuff I'm looking for. So usually what I'll do is I'll just add in a couple of layers, set to something like normal with a full opacity so I can preview the roughness. And then I'll try and kind of come through here and select different ones. So the ones that I usually like to build up detail with are things, if I'm doing a roughness effect where it's going to be a rougher effect, I'll usually look for a mask that has maybe some more black and white areas. So something along the lines of this type of thing. And then I'll try to add that as an add effect. So as an example, let's just take, say, these spots, and we could add this in. So this is going to give us some nice roughness breakup. You can sort of see that effect there. And then if I was to combine that together with like linear dodge, you'll see that now this is being added over the top of our existing roughness. So we want to play around with that. We can do, depending on the effects here, so we can just cycle through these as well. If we select them, you can just come through and cycle through the different effects and see how that can kind of impact things. So yeah, depending on the blend mode, you can get different effects with that. Let me try and put this back to... Yeah, it's kind of darkening things down a little bit, and I didn't really want that. I just wanted these kind of spot type effects. So just by changing the opacity there, we can get that looking pretty good. And then we can just keep duplicating up effects like this and adding variation basically with the different looks. I also really like these kind of drip roughness effects. These are always really nice for adding nice variety into your texture. So again, we can use different blend modes for that, experiment with those, and then change up things like the tiling. And you can see that we can easily add some of this nice kind of staining and things like that. We can always paint these types of effects out as we work as well. So that can be a pretty nice way to add variety into the roughness. For the color variety, it's kind of the same process, but we just want to be working with color variation. So what I usually do here is look for a grunge that has a variety of black and white. So it goes from full black all the way to white. So something like this is a good example. And I'll do the same thing. I'll set that to triplanar with a tiling. So that's a pretty good one. I'll usually just look for ones that have as much black and white variety as possible and sort of swap those out in the same way, try and find something that's going to work. So this is a pretty nice one, for example. And then we'll sort of tile that up a bit. And then when we've got this working, we'll then add a filter, and we'll use, not the hue saturation, we'll use the gradient filter. And then this is, so what I'm going to try and do here is basically use these to give me different color variety. So at this stage, I just want really extreme color variety. I don't want, you know, something that makes sense, like some nice variation in color. And then I can actually just reduce the opacity of this in terms of the base color. So we go over to our base color channel and we'll reduce the opacity of this. And we'll have this on a really low opacity. And then what this will do is it will slowly start to increase some color variation into this particular result. And if this is getting too strong, you can put this on a 1. You can see that it still can be pretty strong in terms of color. So what you would want to do there is then reduce the opacity of it again in the mask. And then we can duplicate this up and change the colors again. So we'll go now for maybe some blue sort of colors. And then we can, once we've got those blues in there, we can then swap out the actual texture again. So let's swap this one out for this guy. And we'll just put in now a little bit of the blue colors. And you can start to see that we're mixing in all of these different colors. And then with these actual masks as well, you can play around with the contribution in the balance so that we can see how that's sort of adding in this nice color variation. And then we'll do the same thing here. So I'm going to now go for more of a orangey red kind of colors, I think. So we'll go something like yellows and oranges. So just mixing in these different colors into the base color so that it just has a bit more color variety, right? And so I'm going to swap this one out as well. Just come into here. Okay, and then I might want to put a little bit more of that yellow-red kind of look in there. And you can mask these as well if you want to. So that's kind of how we just start to build up some just different variation into the material. We've got now some roughness variation, some color variation. And then I start to get maybe a little bit more specific with my effects. So usually for plastics, and we saw that with some of the references, they have sort of like a darker color in the crevices, and then they sometimes will have lighter edges. So those are, again, good things to do. So something you can do if you want to easily do that taking some of our underlying colors is you create a layer here. So we're going to add this into a folder, and we're going to just call this edges. And for this one, I want to set the folder here to pass through, and we'll set this one to pass through in the base color. So now we have, effectively, this is like collapsing the layer stack. So we'll call this lighter edges, and then we'll duplicate again, and we'll create a darker recesses, right? So we can do that by adding in our black mask and just adding in, say, a generator. So if we were to take something like the dirt one here, we can actually get some kind of dirt mask, which is feeling pretty good. And I probably would, for the dirt mask itself, I'm going to reduce a little bit of the grunge and maybe the impact of this. So it's going to be a little bit lighter in there. And then to darken this down, it's really straightforward. We would just basically add a filter here with the hue saturation, and then we can actually darken our base color a little bit there. So you can see if we jump over to the base color view, that's now creating a darker result. We could also tweak, say, the roughness as well, just by adding in another hue saturation, and we'll just impact the roughness only and then brighten up the roughness. You'll have to jump again over to the roughness channel though and set these layers to pass through. So if you set those both to pass through, now you'll see that we get some of that roughness impact happening there, which is pretty cool. So yeah, so that's a way to get darker, and then we could basically copy that exact same effect for the edges. So we'll go back over to our base color view. This one, we're going to add another filter with a hue saturation for the base color, and we're going to just brighten it. But for this guy, I want some edges. So one of the other things I like to do when I'm doing masks is I'll come over to the smart masks and use these. So if we do a search for edges, we can grab different types of edges. So for example, for plastic, we might want something that's a bit softer. So maybe experiment with some of these ones, which are dirt soft edges, and you can just drag and drop that into the mask, and you'll see that the mask that creates is something like this, right? And then you can experiment with the amount that is contributing and the overall kind of level of this and everything. If you want to play with the values of that, you can always just add a levels kind of back into it. So this would be a nice way to just create those slightly lighter edges. This obviously has like a bunch of grunge kind of impacting it as well. So for that, we can always play around with the opacity of it and tweak some of the actual values of what we're getting here. But you can see that that creates like a nice lighter plastic kind of feel to our edges. And we can experiment now. We've got this with the value that we're brightening this. We probably don't want to brighten too much. We don't want it to be super obvious there. And again, same for the roughness, right? We can add a filter with our hue saturation and just get a slightly rougher result on those edges. So if we sort of boost this up a little bit, you can start to see that, yeah, that's just catching the light a little bit and giving us some nice detail. So this is a nice way to add some more variety. Then we can take a closer look at some of the details that we're coming through here. So you can see that we have some darker staining, we have some drips and things like that. So again, those kind of details are pretty good to get in. And you can notice, if we turn this off and look at the reference example, that's some of the bits that I put in as well. So I have sort of go through these again. We have our like drips, like little streaks and things. We have our roughness and our color variation. We have some of that lighter edges as, again, same kind of stuff. We add a surface detail, which we'll get into in a little bit, and you can see some smaller kind of stains and details there. So that's all really nice little adjustments we can make. So let's try and work on some of those other ones here as well. So now we have this nice material kind of coming together. I'm going to try and do I want to do the drips and the streaks. So we'll do some streaks or drips. So those are simple to do as well. Same kind of idea. Usually for that sort of stuff, I'll search for leaks or I'll search for drips, and usually you'll pull up or streaks, you'll pull up those kind of masks. I think drip, is it leak that usually gives you the most reliable ones as far as masks are concerned. You can sort of see how these could be pretty nice kind of details. You can also, we'll get into hand painting some of this type of stuff later in the class, but yeah, I'm just focusing on procedural generation for these at the moment. So this kind of stuff is great. We obviously already played around with those kind of things. And then I would just basically add in a fill layer to begin with. And sometimes what can be helpful is setting it to red and then using a mask with it set to red. So you can actually start to see how that might look. So if we had these streaks and everything, we can go for our triplanar and we can tweak our scale of that. And you can see that we have these leaks. Maybe we can go for slightly bigger. And then we can always swap this out, right? So swap this out for another one. So this one is a really nice one for those smaller leaks and drips. And then from that, you can tweak the mask. So maybe get a bit of contrast going on in there. And you can see this is adding some really nice detail there. So then we can just come in with some value. And I think usually this is a darker value. So I'll probably go for just color pick from our reference, like a slightly darker base color here. And we can kind of get that in. Something like this. So you can start to see those leaks coming through, some of those little drips. And you can just vary this type of stuff up more and more. So you have this one coming in, and then you can duplicate this up and swap it out for another version or variation here. So we'll just go in with our grunge leaks spots. So that one can be pretty good as well. And then playing around with the mask and some of the contrast that gives, you can sort of see how that's giving us a slightly different result. This one, I like to just try to vary up colors as well as much as possible, so things aren't always exactly the same. You can just start to see how we're building that type of stuff up. So that's how we would do some more details like that kind of stuff. And then once we've got into this one, I also want to add some surfacing. So getting up close to these kind of materials, you can see often with this kind of stuff that we have some sort of feeling that there's like a texture to this, like either from it being either painted or there's some kind of like surface detail to this, like a micro detail to stuff. So as we're working through, I like to try and add that. So this one is looking a little bit like it's got more of a powder coated feel to it. So to do those kind of things, it's really straightforward. We'll go over, I like to use the filter effects. So we'll come over into these, the material finishes, and you just basically drag and drop these into the project, and you'll see that you get this kind of effect, right? And you obviously need to change up the scale of stuff. So tweak the scale of this and we can change the intensity. But this is just giving us that extra level of detail to everything, making it feel more like a surface with that kind of nice response as well with the roughness and everything. And that can feel really good when we start to get these little details and things coming in there, right? There's other ones in here. So you've got the grainy is pretty nice as well for, say, a painted metal. You could see that could definitely give us more of that like thicker paint kind of feel, and experimenting again with the scale and maybe the intensity of that. So that's obviously a very different look to what we have here with the powder coated. So it depends on the look that you're wanting to go for. And I also really like the rough one, but I like to use the rough with some blur. So I'll usually come in with this guy. This one is great for metals. So I would blur the result just on the height map. I think actually on the normals, I would blur this type of result, and it can give this kind of like bumpy looking metal, which again, I find is a really nice result depending on the type of material you're going for. So that one can be pretty good as well. And then finally, what I like to do when I'm building out my base material here is I like to add some adjustments. So I'll just do like a final adjustment layer. And this can just be good for finally tweaking things when you get to the end of the model and you want to just say balance out the base color, or you wanted to tweak the roughness or whatever you want to do there. That can be great for that kind of adjustment. So we just set that to pass through, and we'd have to do that in the channels that we want to adjust. So we come over to pass through. And as I said, this is like collapsing down the layer stack here. So we're going to add in a adjustment here with a filter, and I'm going to come in with the hue saturation So this will just allow us, I keep it empty to begin with, but you can brighten or darken the base color here. And we can just keep that here. And then we can do another one just for the roughness as well. And so then this can also give us a tweak. We can make it shinier on the roughness. It's going to globally adjust everything below it, right? So that's kind of giving us where we want to get to as far as the adjustments are concerned. So this is looking like a pretty good base for our dark painted metal. So the next part of the tutorial, what I want to do is start to add more specific detailing. So in this example, you can see if we sort of jump over to here, this is what our base material looks like. And then we start to add detail. So here we have these kind of bigger global roughness changes. We start to do some adjustment to our edges, and then we start to do our metal scratches, and we do build up our dirt and our grease and everything. And then we add other details. So we'll go through that as the next step. Okay, so now I want to start working on some of the more unique detail that we can see in terms of our references. So one of the things I definitely want to get across is some of these like bigger, larger staining type results that you can see in these areas on our references. And then I also want to try and get the dirt and grime and the metal edgeware as well. So that will kind of pull the base material together, hopefully as a bit more of a finalized first material, right? So we first need to just start by doing a bit of organization here. So I'm going to select everything we created last time and basically group this together as our base. So this will just provide the basis of our dark metal or painted metal that we have here. We obviously have our dirt. I do want to build out a metal, and so for the sake of time, I'm probably just going to use some smart material type ones that we can use there, just so we can get something going for the edgeware and everything. So in this case, the one that I actually built, just to sort of go over that though, so you can sort of see how that one was generated, I can just show that. It's not a super complicated material, and in most cases I actually have a lot of these kind of materials saved out in my shelf as smart materials anyway. So things like the base steel, like a metal steel, I just copied that straight into there. So this is actually, you can see, as a very, very close example of what we did for the plastic. So that's why I didn't really feel like I need to cover it in a great amount of detail. Again, same kind of idea. We have the base material, we build out our roughnesses and color variation and everything. So I'm always trying to focus mostly on having variety in the base color and variation in the roughnesses as well with those grunge passes, and that's what I was trying to get across there. This part is basically where I try to add a bunch of unique detail that you can see in my actual references here. So we do some of these like scratches and things like that. So basically fill out different areas here. We have some staining, which looks like it's kind of scratching up the surface and everything. We actually have some of these guys represented more in normal data as well, in height data, so we can feel like these are more scratched and broken up, and it's got some of those like smaller kind of dinks and things like this that you can see. And that is just for our base metal. That's the base metal that we used. And then I also create a version where I add some dirt over the top of this. So that's like more of a dirty version, which I actually use in some of these areas when we assign the material to it. So that's the kind of overview of that. So for the case of this, we'll just create a base one, and you can actually use, I think in the library there's some pretty good metal smart materials, so you could just come in here with the steel or the silver armor or something like that. I like these ones. These are generally pretty good smart materials, so we can just enable and have a look at that one. So this is turn the dirt off. This is what the silver armor looks like. So that one is a pretty good metal that you can definitely use. Just check when you're looking at these though for the PBR values, because sometimes they can be a bit dark. So for this one, I would potentially look at just coming in here with a pass-through layer, and then you can just add a hue saturation on the base color just to brighten it up enough that it's going to not be red in the PBR value. So that one's nice and bright now. So that can be our base metal. So we'll just call that base metal there. And then for the anchor point, you can just add in your pass through. You've got the pass through here, so this is the adjustment. So I'm just going to add to, yeah, actually let me just do a separate anchor point layer. So silver, no, sorry, base metal, and I'm just going to add anchor points to this. And then what we'll do is come through to the different layers like the roughness and everything, just set those up as pass through. So I can now use this metal as a reference later up in my material there. So we can just turn off our base materials, turn back on our plastic. So yeah, so the first thing we want to do, and if we're looking at our reference material here, is we have these kind of bigger, larger roughness stains. Those are very straightforward to do. So we'll just say roughness or big roughness adjustments. And some of these can also have color into them as well, but it's the same process as before, where we basically just go over into our grunges here, and we're looking for something that can resemble some of the detail that we can see over in our references here. So we jump over to this one, you've got these kind of stain type looks, right? So we're looking for something like that, which we can use. And a lot of these as well are adjustable with parameters and things. So you could always put these in, and then once you've got them in there, then you can always just easily swap them out, right? So I usually go through the same process of adding them into the mask and then adding that into the fill. Sometimes you have to wait a second for this to adjust. Setting it up to be triplanar and tiling it. These ones we're probably not going to want to tile as large as we did before, because obviously this is going to be a big adjustment. So we do our roughness and everything here. You can see that we can start to get that feel really quickly by just kind of having a slightly brighter roughness. So that one is already feeling pretty good. And then we can do the color as well. For the color, I would usually just color pick off of the base color itself, and then maybe darken down slightly or tweak the color of it maybe just a little bit so it's a bit more saturated potentially. Just play around and find something that you find works for you. Just don't go too crazy with the color, otherwise it can break the PBR values. And also maybe just play around with a lower opacity on the color, because I would definitely not want to go too detailed with that. So that one's a good example of like how we can actually start to work that up. And then we can do the same. Sometimes it's nice to have the occasional one that's a little bit goes the opposite way, right? So we have something at the moment that's rougher, but now we can go with an effect like this type of one that we have, but instead of it being sort of rough, we're going to actually make it shinier. So this one can just catch the light in places, so you can sort of see that there. We will need to experiment with the mask of this, because we're probably not going to want this to be coming in loads of places. So that's why you want to sort of experiment with just swapping these masks out for different versions and not having this appear in too many places. That's probably a pretty nice example. And you can build up as many of these as you want, but this is kind of the general idea for those like bigger roughness style adjustments. So next up after that, we do some like larger edge adjustment type things. We don't have to do that. Those are that's an optional thing, but it's the same process as what we did in our original edges. Just, I think I did experiment with some slightly sort of more intense ones. So if we look at that, actually, let's just see what that does. So those global edges, let's turn off some of these dirts and everything. Yeah, so those basically just kind of darken the edges and create some effects and everything in there. So that's what we're doing with these global edges there. So it's creating much more of an obvious effect there. And I think with these, we have like more of an edge wear type of effect there. You can sort of see that. So that's basically what those do. Those are similar to these edge adjustments. So maybe we can just duplicate these ones up a bit and then experiment with the intensity of those. So let's try and go, I'm just going to try and go like a bit more. All right, so that's that one. I want to do maybe more of the edges and just play with the dark, like these being a darker edge. So this can also be about the mask as well, because we don't want to have the same masks. We always want to try and vary stuff up and have different masks and different generators. So I think the metal edgeware is actually the one I used for this to kind of get more of that sort of like staining on the edge, so you can sort of see how that is looking, which this is definitely more of a global kind of effect specific for this particular area, because I wanted certain sections. Again, it's to kind of get this type of result where you see that it becomes darker in places. That was like the impact I was trying to go for. So you can sort of see how that really helps with that type of look. Okay, and then next up I did the metal edgeware and the scratches and things like that. So for this one, this is where we're going to actually use our mask or our material from the metal. So we want to come in here and we're going to select our base metal, and then we're going to set this to be metallic, which is going to bring in that base metal here. And then we can turn everything else off so we can preview this. And then for the roughness, we'll also select the base metal roughness. And this is that steel armored material, right? So that's coming through. And then if we just turn this on and off, you can see that. And then for the edgeware, what I mostly would do, again, is experiment with smart masks. I find some of these can be really helpful, and then you can combine them together. So gun edges is really nice, usually for sort of small type edgeware, so it's not impacting things very much. So we'll just remove that one. So you can see here, that's with the, oops, actually, let me just reapply that, but I want to apply that actually on my metal edgeware layer. Yeah, so you can see this is the gun edges, and that's kind of how that looks. And at the moment, this is obviously very kind of in your face. Everything is very obvious. So we can make adjustments to kind of how much of that effect we actually have kind of coming through there for the base material, just by tweaking the opacity. That's kind of how that's going to look. So we can sort of see that. And then, so that's sort of chipping away the edges. The other thing you can also do is, this is very binary in its mask. So we can always add grunges back into this to try to vary that up as well. So if we go for grunge and try and pick something that has a little bit of interest in there, rather than a filter, let's just try and add a fill layer. And we're just going to drag and drop that onto the mask. And then for this guy, we'll do the same thing as well. Try planar. And I'm going to set this to maybe 4. And then we'll just do a subtract for this, so that it's basically going to take away from that mask. For these, you probably want to keep this like a little bit larger. And I probably am going to select something just a little bit softer than that powdery result. So yeah, so now you can see that this is just varying it up, so it's not always the same intensity kind of everywhere, right? That's something that's important for these types of masks to make them feel more natural. So here we have that kind of edgeware type result and how that's looking. Remember that once we actually mask all of this out as well, so this is going to be our painted metal. This one is the edgeware, sorry. So when we mask this, in the end, we're going to do a mask with a color selection. So remember that this is only going to appear in these areas. So you don't need to worry about it, what it looks like on some of these tendrils and other things as well. Just mostly on the final kind of parts of the model, if that makes sense. So yeah, so that's sort of roughly what I would say on the edgeware. And then you can then duplicate this up and try and have other masks that you use as well. So we'll go for maybe edgeware here again, and we can maybe look at edge damages. So just pulling these in and experimenting with the different ones, you can sort of see the type of edgeware results that these can give. So here's another one that also adds some nice interest and break up as well. And we can experiment with the overall global sort of look of that and how much the textures are contributing to some of these effects as well. So we can just experiment with all of that stuff and get the result that we're after. So yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. And then I would probably just copy this effect onto here as well. So where's our effect? Paste the effect. So this one, again, we're just sort of breaking up the details and things with new grunges and new masks and everything. So something like that is already feeling pretty nice. So that covers like the basics of edgeware. We will also hand paint the edgeware as well, because if we look at our references here, one of the things that's really nice is we have these little smaller chips, which I've managed to get with some of those procedural results already. But then if we look at this one, we have these kind of scratches, which are a lot more directional, and they're much more specific detail that there's one scratch in a particular location. So we're going to want to do stuff like that a bit more as a hand painted pass, right? So that's what I would say there. So that covers that stuff. And I think the last thing to go through is the dirt effect. So this one, again, we're going to add in a new folder, and we're going to call this dirt or grease, whatever we want to call it. I think I built up in my example different types of ones. I have like a general dirt. I have different grease types effects as well. So yeah, you can build this all up sort of slowly and over time as well. So cool. So you add a fill layer in for this one, and we've obviously already got our dirts in here, so we can come in and reference those again with our base color and everything and our roughness, and get our actually we needed to make sure, sorry, that we added a fill in there rather than that guy, and then we'll come in with the dirt, and then we'll do the same thing. So we'll have a I think I was selecting the wrong dirt, which is why it's coming in as it's not actually coming in there. Okay, so now we have our dirt. So for this, in the references that I had this idea of, you obviously usually get dirt in recesses and crevices. So that's usually a good pass to do just generally for most models. I tend to add dirt kind of into the recesses and the crevices, sort of around objects and everything. I usually find that gives a nice look. But then in this particular case, I also wanted these kind of nice, in the recesses, you see that it kind of builds up, and then we also get this like staining effect on the edges as well. So you can see if I turn this one on here from my references, how that's kind of coming together. So we have a general sort of dirt that just kind of comes in everywhere. You sort of see that. Then we have this grease effect, and the grease, if we turn these guys on, you'll see that it has that kind of like darker, it sort of builds up. I think I've actually tweaked this as well a little bit from what it is originally. I think this one is the one that does the darker edges. So it was a little bit darker, I think, before. But you can sort of see that it builds up that kind of darker staining around the edges. That was like the impact I wanted to get. So when you sort of zoom in on some of these, you can see that. So that's that kind of result, and we'll go through kind of how I worked up these different ones. So the first one is just like a general dirt, and I would usually add fill layers with the hue saturation here, so I can tweak the darkness or the color of my dirt as well using the hue saturation. And then again, you can use smart masks, so we could search for, say, dirt and just try and pull these on and see what types of results and masks those are going to give. So you can see that this one is like quite a nice type of one. Here we've got our dirt cavities, so you can usually just pull these in, drag and drop them on, and try and find something that you think looks pretty good. Like this one is not a bad like overall kind of dirt, although I'm not 100% on my hue saturation, I'm not 100% on my color tweaking that I've done here. So we can just sort of experiment. I maybe go like a little bit darker and a bit more red with that one, but you can sort of see that can give us like a little bit of an overall kind of cavity style dirt. I also do generally like using the standard dirt generator, because this one has like a nice, it's just easy to tweak as well how you want it. So you get this kind of overall style dirt. You can change like the amount of this, you can change the contribution of grunge and the scale of the grunge and everything, and then tweak, say, the contrast. And you can use this just to get the particular visual that you're after. So I do really like using that one as like an ambient style dirt here. So that's sort of how that is looking overall, which is cool. And then to build up our edge style dirt, or the one where we create like darker on the edges and everything, that one is easy to do as well. We just, again, we need a mask. So for this, we want something cavity based. So maybe it's like dirt cavities. We could pull that one in and see what that can give us. Yeah, so this one is already giving us like a nice kind of cavity style mask, which is good. So we can tweak from this cavity by having sort of adjustments to the grunge, adjustments to the levels, and we can try and get something that's like giving us that dirt. And usually for this as well, I just make it really dark so we can see where it's actually impacting stuff, and then we can adjust it later, right? So we're just starting to see where it's coming in. That's looking pretty good. But, when you look at stuff like this, it's not everywhere on the mask. So we need to have other ways to break that up like we did before. So what I would usually do is the same kind of thing as I had done before with some of my other effects where I have these grunges. So we can just copy this effect and then paste that effect in here. And you can see that we can now kind of use that to basically break things up more on that mask. And we probably would want to tweak this because we don't want it to be completely eradicating the mask everywhere. We just want it to sort of take away in some of these places, right? So you can sort of see how we're building that up here as well. And then we can always experiment with expanding that mask a little bit, and you can sort of see how that's building up these nice shapes. One of the other things I like to do as well is I'll use the slope blur. So we'll just come in with the blur slope, and this can be really nice for breaking up those edges even more. And we're going to be playing around with maybe setting that to a min or a max effect. So that can just break up that dirt mask even more with the type of look that we want to go for. Because if you look at this particular area, we have this kind of more undulated sort of warped look to things. So that can be pretty nice to get that sort of effect. We can also add maybe let's try and add, say, a contrast to this as well. So we can get much more of a contrasted mask, which we can start to actually visualize how things are looking. So this could definitely work quite nicely already with some tweaking to this to sort of experiment a bit more with how much we're actually revealing here. But this is already giving us that kind of darker dirt around the edges. So from that, now what we would do is tweak back into a range where the dirt actually kind of makes sense. And you can now see that we have this dirt here. And then how do we go from this to having some more of those like edges? So the way to do that is to add an anchor point to this. So this is going to be our edge dirt. So we'll add an anchor to this. And then I'm going to just duplicate my layer again. And I'm just going to cancel out the mask and add a fill in there. So we'll take our edge dirt. And now we can see we have our edge there, which is looking pretty good. So from that, we've got our mask here. We're going to use another filter. So we want to take our filter here and we want to search for mask outline. And this is basically going to take the mask that we've just generated and turn this into an edge, right? So you can sort of see that there. So as we add this on top, we can then now darken down our texture, and you can see that this is giving us this nice edge to the dirt, which is pretty cool. And we can tweak those values of that mask. So we can experiment with the width of that. We can experiment with blur. You can experiment with the shape that you're getting from it and everything. And I like to as well, you can see that it's almost like a beveled result. So if you didn't want that, you can just add a filter again and maybe play around with, say, a contrast. So if we do that here, we can just contrast that mask. So now it's like a nice thick line that's going around everything, which is pretty good. And then a lot of the effects that we had before, so say the slope blur and the grunges, we can then bring those kind of back in on top to vary that up. So we now have some slope blur type stuff that's breaking this up, and we also have this grunge that's breaking this up. And then the value of this, we want to make it darker, but we don't want it to be as dark, and maybe we can play with the saturation of that to kind of experiment with it standing out a little bit more, right? So you can sort of start to see how that works, and then it's just a case of tweaking the settings we have. So with the The mask outline, we have that guy there. We have our contrast on the mask outline. I'm going to tweak the values and things of this a little bit so we can get it a little bit darker. So yeah, and then that's starting to resemble this kind of like look, right? Where we can see it sort of, yeah, built up like that. So that's basically the way I worked with this particular result. And then we can come in with our grunge overall that sort of breaks things up. And we can check our mask at all times as well, just by alt-clicking the mask and experimenting with that. And then we have our slope blur as well. I think I'm going to tweak the slope blur intensity a little bit. So yeah, you can kind of see how we're starting to build up that sort of look and the feel. And then if you wanted to kind of overall, if you want to overall break this up, you can just come back over to your grunge map and increase or decrease this, so you can see that we can reduce the amount of that dirt build up. Or if we just want a overall, because at the moment that still feels like it's because we add the contrast, that still feels like it's getting pretty binary. So we could add another one over the top of this kind of after the contrast, which is just gonna give us like more of a softer breakup on some of these as well. And again, you can play around with the opacity of that and everything, tweaking things, and just experimenting more with this guy, maybe going for less contrast on that as well. So we can just start to break this up with some more grayscale values, because that's one of the things that can really help with this type of stuff, is you don't want everything to be binary all the time. It's nice to kind of vary that up. So you can see here, just by adding this guy in, that's taken those masks to just feeling a bit softer in some places. That can really help when it comes to that like breakup of the different masks and things, and you can sort of see how that's looking, right? So yeah, so that brings in the sort of edge of this, the end of this particular material. And then for the metal edgeware, right, that we have here, the one that we created, to mask that into those sections, like that's really easy to do as well. We can just come in with our metal let's make it metal assignment, and I'm just going to add in a fill layer with let's go fill, and then I'm going to come in with that metal. So with our base metal here, and then we'll say metallic, and then we'll say roughness, and we'll choose the base metal, right? And then from there we can just add a mask to this. We'll do actually, let's do a mask with color selection, and we'll just pick the green section. So that's assigning the metal to those areas. We would probably want to work that metal up a little bit more, like I had done in my previous example, but we've shown a lot of the techniques for doing that so far in the class already. So this is like, we're bringing this together. This is now our base materials. I'm not going to cover the other base materials I did, because again, those are kind of the same process. So I have a brass and a painted metal, so we can assign those in now as well. But the same process basically for getting all of this stuff together. So if I just come over to my smart materials, I have this tarnished brass, so we can assign that in there. And again, these are all built in exactly the same way as they were for the main materials, right? So if I just bring this in here, we can see that we have our brass in those areas, and then we can also do the yellow painted one as well. So I'll just pull this in here, and this is just going to build up the base materials, and you just assign them using the material assignment color ID selection, right? If you wanted, as I mentioned, if you want to change the assignment of these, we'll just reveal that mask. Let me turn that one off. If you wanted to come in and say assign a different section to that brass material, it's just a case of doing that, and you can assign it really easily. So and then if you don't want that, you can obviously just remove the paint effect, right? So now at this sort of stage of the lectures, we should have our base materials figured out for our plastic and metal, and then you would definitely want to just take a quick pass on the other one. So I would probably do a little bit more into this with, say, dirt and things like that, but this should get us into a good place. So now we can start on some more of our specific details, like our hand painted details and things like that. Hey everyone, so in this video I just wanted to give a recap and talk about the homework assignment for this week. So in this particular series of videos we've gone over how to actually texture our Beetle robot. So I went through the process of reference gathering and actually creating a new reference board for the week in terms of texturing and everything, so collecting new references that we could use that are specific to this particular week. So you can see here we break that down into different materials and try to figure out how we're going to tackle the robot from a texturing perspective. I then showed a couple of techniques on how to structure the actual file and set up the layers and everything, and worked briefly on anchor points to show how I use those in the project. And then we actually create our smart materials, and we try to build up the individual material definitions. So we have this main dark painted metal material, and we work on our actual metal as well. And then once we've got all of our smart materials working, we then add some more unique detail to those on top, and try to detail those out further, and then assign them to the different parts of the model. So you can see in the end everything is getting assigned to all the other parts of the model. And we're trying to keep our bakes for, say, the ID map to be consistent. So when we assign them, things get assigned correctly to the right places. So that's also worth kind of pointing out as well. And then finally, to finish everything off, we add a bunch of hand-painted detail that's specific to the model and specific to the individual texture sets to make sure that we can add that really nice, unique detail that's going to sell the look of the model. So for the homework assignment this week, the expectation is that we would build out a new reference board, which we're going to use for texturing. And I would definitely try to focus your attention in making sure that you break things down into individual materials. And you don't have to texture him exactly as I have textured in my example. It doesn't have to be the same colors. And if you're using if you're doing a completely different animal mech, then you maybe won't even be doing a beetle, so that's also fine as well. But yeah, so that would be the advice that I would give there. And then as far as the texturing is concerned, work on the smart materials first, get those assigned on one of the texture sets, propagate them across, and then do your pass on the hand painted detail. So by the end of this week, we should have everything to a more finished textured state. So that would be my expectation for this week.